In this video, we will begin looking at Chapter 3, which is the first of 7 chapters detailing different types of knob knots. Chapter 3 is dedicated to single-strand stopper knots, also known as terminal knots. This variety of knob knot is generally tied as a terminal knot in the end of a rope where it forms a knob or bunch. The usual purpose of these knots is to prevent unreeving. Ashley says that they shouldn't be used to prevent unlaying or fraying, except in small cord, twine, and similar material, as a whipping is preferable for large and valuable material. Ashley also notes that the difference between single-strand stopper knots and the single-strand lanyard knots in the next chapter is an arbitrary one. Any decorative stopper knot with a good lead can also serve as a lanyard knot. There is no structural difference between these two types of knob knots. The use is what determines the classification. For a lanyard knot, it is commonly tied in the central part or bight of a rope, and most often used for decorative purposes. For working the knots in this chapter, Ashley recommends the use of a small pricker. As has been mentioned before, the Ashley Book of Knots was published in 1944, so the information, although still pertinent, is specific to tying knots material that were used at that time. The information discussed in this video and future ones won't necessarily add to Ashley's statements or address how these knots and their properties apply to modern-day tying materials. Now, getting into the knots of this chapter, we will look at the overhand knot and its variations. The overhand knot may also be called by several different names, including simple, single, thumb, common, and ordinary knot. It is the simplest of all knots and often the starting point for more elaborate ones. It is the smallest of all knots and uses the least amount of material. Some other notes that Ashley makes about this knot is that it is secure but very weak, reducing the strength of the rope by as much as 50%. It jams and is difficult to untie, which often injures the fibers of the rope. These are the reasons that Ashley says that this knot should only be tied in small material that isn't to be used again and where there is quite a good margin of strength. When the overhand knot is tied by one hand, it is usually called the thumb knot. This method of tying is commonly done with sewing thread and twine. A loose round turn is first made around the tip of the pointer finger. The thumb is then extended, which rolls the end through the turn once or twice. The standing part of the thread is pulled and a knot is formed. It will either be a single or double overhand knot depending on how many times the end rolled through the turn. The double overhand knot is tied as if you were tying 2 single overhand knots. When using a cat o' nine tails or snapper of an ox whip, it is called a blood knot. A threefold overhand knot or larger one will need to be worked into shape, and because of this, it is considered more decorative than practical. It may be easier to tie a larger overhand knot by first tying it the usual way, and then adding as many turns as desired by wrapping the loop around the end. The last overhand knot and entry for this video is tied in a doubled end, making a bulky stopper knot. In construction, this knot has no difference from the loop knot, which is also called the overhand loop. In the next video, we will continue with the single-strand stopper knots, looking at the figure 8 knot and its variations.